The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is an American children's novel written by author L. Frank Baum and illustrated by W. W. Denslow. Originally published by the George M. Hill Company in Chicago on May 17, 1900. It has since been reprinted on numerous occasions, most often under the title The Wizard of Oz, which is the title of the popular 1902 Broadway musical adaptation as well as the iconic 1939 musical film adaptation. The story chronicles the adventures of a young farm girl named Dorothy in the magical land of Oz, after she and her pet dog Toto are swept away from their Kansas home by a cyclone. The novel is one of the best-known stories in American literature and has been widely translated. The Library of Congress has declared it America's greatest and best-loved homegrown fairy tale. Its groundbreaking success and the success of the Broadway musical, adapted from the novel, led Baum to write 13 additional Oz books that serve as official sequels to the first story. Baum dedicated the book to my good friend and comrade, my wife, Maud Gage Baum. In January 1901, George M. Hill Company completed printing the first edition, a total of 10,000 copies, which quickly sold out. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz sold 3 million copies by the time it entered the public domain in 1956. Publication. The book was published by George M. Hill Company. Its first edition had a printing of 10,000 copies and was sold in advance of the publication date of September 1, 1900. On May 17, 1900, the first copy of the book came off the press. Baum assembled it by hand and presented it to his sister Mary Louise Baum Brewster. The public saw the book for the first time at a book fair at the Palmer House in Chicago, July 5 to 20. The book's copyright was registered on August 1. Full distribution followed in September. By October 1900, the first edition had already sold out and the second edition of 15,000 copies was nearly depleted. In a letter to his brother Harry, Baum wrote that the book's publisher George M. Hill predicted a sale of about 250,000 copies. In spite of this favorable conjecture, Hill did not initially predict that the book would be phenomenally successful. He agreed to publish the book only when the manager of the Chicago Grand Opera House, Fred R. Hamlin, committed to making The Wonderful Wizard of Oz into a musical stage play to publicize the novel. The play The Wizard of Oz debuted on June 16, 1902. It was revised to suit adult preferences and was crafted as a musical extravaganza, with the costumes modeled after Denslow's drawings. Hill's publishing company became bankrupt in 1901, so Baum and Denslow agreed to have the Indianapolis-based Bobbs Merrill Company resume publishing the novel. Baum's son Harry Neal told the Chicago Tribune in 1944 that L. Frank told his children whimsical stories before they became material for his books. Harry called his father the swellest man I knew, a man who was able to give a decent reason as to why blackbirds cooked in a pie could afterwards get out and sing. By 1938, more than 1 million copies of the book had been printed. Less than 2 decades later, in 1956, the sales of his novel had grown to 3 million copies in print. Plot. Dorothy is a young girl who lives with her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry and her little dog Toto on a farm in the Kansas prairie. One day, Dorothy and Toto are caught up in a cyclone that deposits her farmhouse into Munchkin country in the magical land of Oz. The falling house has killed the Wicked Witch of the East, the evil ruler of the Munchkins. The Good Witch of the North arrives with 3 grateful Munchkins and gives Dorothy the magical silver shoes that once belonged to the Wicked Witch. The Good Witch tells Dorothy that the only way she can return home is to go to the Emerald City. and asked the great and powerful Wizard of Oz to help her. As Dorothy embarks on her journey, the Good Witch of the North kisses her on the forehead, giving her magical protection from harm. On her way down the yellow brick road, Dorothy attends a banquet held by a Munchkin man named Bock. The next day, Dorothy frees the Scarecrow from the pole on which he is hanging, applies oil from a can to the rusted connections of the Tin Woodman, and meets the Cowardly Lion. The Scarecrow wants a brain, the Tin Woodman wants a heart, and the Cowardly Lion wants courage. So Dorothy encourages the three of them to journey with her and Toto to the Emerald City to ask for help from the wizard. After several adventures, the travelers enter the gates of the Emerald City and meet the Guardian of the Gates, who asks them to wear green-tinted spectacles to keep their eyes from being blinded by the city's brilliance. Each one is called to see the wizard. The wizard appears to Dorothy as a giant head on a marble throne, to the Scarecrow as a lovely lady in silk gauze, to the Tin Woodman as a terrible beast, and to the Cowardly Lion as a ball of fire. The wizard agrees to help them all if they kill the Wicked Witch of the West, who rules over Oz's Winky Country. The Guardian warns them that no one has ever managed to defeat the witch. The Wicked Witch of the West sees the travelers approaching with her one telescopic eye. She sends a pack of wolves to tear them to pieces, but the Tin Woodman kills them with his axe. She sends wild crows to peck their eyes out, but the Scarecrow kills them by breaking their necks. She summons a swarm of black bees to sting them, but they are killed trying to sting the Tin Woodman while the Scarecrow's straw hides the other three. She sends her Winky soldiers to attack them, but the Cowardly Lion stands firm to repel them. Finally, she uses the power of the Golden Cap to send the winged monkeys to capture Dorothy, Toto, and the Cowardly Lion, unstuff the Scarecrow, and dent the Tin Woodman. Dorothy is forced to become the Wicked Witch's personal slave, while the witch schemes to steal Dorothy's silver shoes. The Wicked Witch successfully tricks Dorothy out of one of her silver shoes. Angered, Dorothy throws a bucket of water at her and is shocked to see the witch melt away. The Winkies rejoice at being freed of the witch's tyranny and help restuff the Scarecrow and mend the Tin Woodman. They ask the Tin Woodman to become their ruler, which he agrees to do after helping Dorothy return to Kansas. Dorothy finds the Golden Cap and summons the winged monkeys to carry her and her companions back to the Emerald City. The king of the winged monkeys tells how he and the other monkeys are bound by an enchantment to the cap by the sorceress Gaelette from the north, and that Dorothy may use the cap to summon the winged monkeys 2 more times. When Dorothy and her friends meet the Wizard of Oz again, Toto tips over a screen in a corner of the throne room that reveals the wizard. He sadly explains he is a humbug, an ordinary old man who, by a hot air balloon, came to Oz long ago from Omaha. The wizard provides the Scarecrow with a head full of bran, pins, and needles, a lot of brand new brains, the Tin Woodman with a silk heart stuffed with sawdust, and the Cowardly Lion a potion of courage. Their faith in the wizard's power gives these items a focus for their desires. The wizard decides to take Dorothy and Toto home and leave the Emerald City. At the send-off, he appoints the Scarecrow to rule in his stead, which he agrees to do after Dorothy returns to Kansas. Toto chases a kitten in the crowd and Dorothy goes after him, but the tethers of the balloon break and the wizard floats away. Dorothy summons the winged monkeys to carry her and Toto home, but they explain they cannot cross the deserts surrounding Oz. The soldier with the green whiskers informs Dorothy that Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, may be able to help her return home. So the friends begin their journey to see Glinda, who lives in Oz's Quadling Country. On the way, The Cowardly Lion kills a giant spider who is terrorizing the animals in a forest. The animals ask the Cowardly Lion to become their king, which he agrees to do after helping Dorothy return to Kansas. Dorothy summons the winged monkeys a third time to fly them over a mountain to Glinda's palace. Glinda greets the travelers and reveals that the silver shoes Dorothy wears can take her anywhere she wishes to go. Dorothy embraces her friends, all of whom will be returned to their new kingdoms through Glinda's 3 uses of the Golden Cap. The Scarecrow to the Emerald City, the Tin Woodman to the Winky Country, and the Lion to the Forest, after which the cap shall be given to the King of the Winged Monkeys. Freeing them, Dorothy takes Toto in her arms, knocks her heels together 3 times, and wishes to return home. Instantly, she begins whirling through the air and rolling through the grass of the Kansas prairie, up to her Kansas farmhouse. Dorothy runs to her Aunt Em, saying, "I'm so glad to be at home again." Quote, illustration and design. The book was illustrated by Baum's friend and collaborator W. Denslow, who also co-held the copyright. The design was lavish for the time, with illustrations on many pages, backgrounds in different colors, and several color plate illustrations. In September 1900, the Grand Rapids Herald wrote that Denslow's illustrations are quite as much of the story as in the writing. The editorial opined that had it not been for Denslow's pictures, the readers would be unable to picture precisely the figures of Dorothy, Toto, and the other characters. The distinctive look led to imitators at the time, most notably Eva Catherine Gibson's Zauberlinda, the Wise Witch, which mimics both the typography and the illustration design of Oz. The typeface was the newly designed monotype old style. Denslow's illustrations were so well known that merchants of many products obtained permission to use them to promote their wares. The forms of the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, the Cowardly Lion, the Wizard, and Dorothy were made into rubber and metal sculptures. Costume jewelry, mechanical toys, and soap were also designed using their figures. A new edition of the book appeared in 1944. With illustrations by Evelyn Kopelman. Although it was claimed that the new illustrations were based on Denslow's originals, they more closely resemble the characters as seen in the famous 1939 film version of Baum's book. Sources of images and ideas. Baum acknowledged the influence of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, which he was deliberately revising in his American fairy tales, to include the wonder without the horrors, the Land of Oz and other locations. Local legend has it that Oz, also known as the Emerald City, was inspired by a prominent castle-like building in the community of Castle Park near Holland, Michigan, where Baum lived during the summer. The yellow brick road was derived from a road at that time paved by yellow bricks. These bricks were located in Peekskill, New York, where Baum attended the Peekskill Military Academy. Baum scholars often refer to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City, as an inspiration for the Emerald City. Other legends suggest that the inspiration came from the Hotel del Coronado near San Diego, California. Baum was a frequent guest at the hotel and had written several of the Oz books there. In a 1903 interview with Publishers Weekly, Baum said that the name Oz came from his file cabinet labeled OZ. Some critics have suggested that Baum may have been inspired by Australia, a relatively new country at the time of the book's original publication. Australia is often colloquially spelled or referred to, though not by Australians themselves, as Oz. Furthermore, in Ozma of Oz, 1907, Dorothy gets back to Oz as the result of a storm at sea while she and Uncle Henry are traveling by ship to Australia. Like Australia, Oz is an island continent somewhere to the west of California with inhabited regions bordering on a great desert. One might imagine that Baum intended Oz to be Australia, or perhaps a magical land in the center of the Great Australian Desert. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Another influence lay in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. A September 1900 review in the Grand Rapids Herald called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz a veritable Alice in Wonderland brought up to the present-day standard of juvenile literature. Baum found Carroll's plots incoherent, but he identified the book's source of popularity as Alice herself, a child with whom the child readers could identify. This influenced his choice of a protagonist. Baum was also influenced by Carroll's belief that children's books should have many pictures and be pleasurable to read. Carroll rejected the Victorian-era ideology that children's books should be saturated with morals, instead believing that children should be allowed to be children. Building on Carroll's style of numerous images accompanying the text, Baum combined the conventional features of a fairy tale, witches and wizards, with the well-known things in his readers' lives, scarecrows and cornfields. American fantasy story. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is considered the first American fairy tale because of its references to clear American locations such as Kansas and Omaha. Baum agreed with authors such as Carroll that fantasy literature was important for children, along with numerous illustrations, but he also wanted to create a story that had recognizable American elements in it, such as farming and industrialization. Baum's personal life. Many of the characters, props, and ideas in the novel were drawn from Baum's experiences. As a child, Baum frequently had nightmares of a scarecrow pursuing him across a field. Moments before the scarecrow's ragged hay fingers nearly gripped his neck, it would fall apart before his eyes. Decades later, as an adult, Baum integrated his tormentor into the novel as the Scarecrow. According to his son Harry, the Tin Woodman was born from Baum's attraction to window displays. He wished to make something captivating for the window displays, so he used an eclectic assortment of scraps to craft a striking figure. From a wash boiler he made a body. From bolted stovepipes he made arms and legs. And from the bottom of a saucepan he made a face. Baum then placed a funnel hat on the figure, which ultimately became the Tin Woodman. John D. Rockefeller was the nemesis of Baum's father, an oil baron who declined to purchase Standard Oil shares in exchange for selling his own oil refinery. Baum scholar Evan I. Schwartz posited that Rockefeller inspired one of the wizard's numerous faces. In one scene in the novel, the wizard is seen as a tyrannical, hairless head. When Rockefeller was 54 years old, the medical condition alopecia caused him to lose every strand of hair on his head, making people fearful of speaking to him. In the early 1880s, Baum's play Matches was being performed when a flicker from a kerosene lantern sparked the rafters, causing the Baum Opera House to be consumed by flames. Scholar Evan I. Schwartz suggested that this might have inspired the Scarecrow's severest terror. "There is only one thing in the world I am afraid of: a lighted match." Quote, in 1890, Baum lived in Aberdeen, which was experiencing a drought, and he wrote a witty story in his Our Landlady column in Aberdeen's The Saturday Pioneer about a farmer who gave green goggles to his horses, causing them to believe that the wood chips that they were eating were pieces of grass. Similarly, the wizard made the people in the Emerald City wear green goggles so that they would believe that their city was built from emeralds. During Baum's short stay in Aberdeen, the dissemination of myths about the plentiful West continued. However, the West, instead of being a wonderland, turned into a wasteland because of a drought and a depression. In 1891, Baum moved his family from South Dakota to Chicago. At that time, Chicago was getting ready for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. Scholar Laura Barrett stated that Chicago was considerably more akin to Oz than to Kansas. After discovering that the myths about the West's incalculable riches were baseless, Baum created an extension of the American frontier in Oz. In many respects, Baum's creation is similar to the actual frontier, save for the fact that the West was still undeveloped at the time. The Munchkins' Dorothy encounters at the beginning of the novel represent farmers. As to the Winkies she later meets, Baum's wife frequently visited her niece, Dorothy Louise Gage. The infant became gravely sick and died on November 11, 1898, from congestion of the brain, at exactly 5 months. When the baby, whom Maud adored as the daughter she never had, died, she was devastated and needed to consume medicine. To assuage her distress, Frank made his protagonist of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz a female named Dorothy. Uncle Henry was modeled after Henry Gage, his wife Maud's father. Bossed around by his wife Matilda, Henry rarely dissented with her. He flourished in business, though, and his neighbors looked up to him. Likewise, Uncle Henry was a passive but hard-working man who looked stern and solemn and rarely spoke. The witches in the novel were influenced by witch-hunting research gathered by Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda. The stories of barbarous acts against accused witches scared Baum. 2 key events in the novel involve wicked witches who both meet their death through metaphorical means. Baum held different jobs, moved a lot, and was exposed to many people. So the inspiration for the story could have been taken from many different aspects of his life. In the introduction to the story, Baum writes that it aspires to being a modernized fairy tale, in which the wonderment and joy are attained and the heartaches and nightmares are left out. Quote, this is one of the explanations that he gives for the inspiration for The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Baum, a former salesman of China, wrote in Chapter 20 about China that had sprung to life. Influence of Denslow, the original illustrator of the novel. W. Denslow could also have influenced the story and the way it has been interpreted. Baum and Denslow had a close working relationship and worked together to create the presentation of the story through the images and the text. Color is an important element of the story and is present throughout the images, with each chapter having a different color representation. Denslow also added characteristics to his drawings that Baum never described. For example, Denslow drew a house and the gates of the Emerald City with faces on them. In the later Oz books, John R. Neal, who illustrated all of the sequels, continued to include these faces on gates, allusions to 19th century America. Baum did not offer any conclusive proof that he intended his novel to be a political allegory. Historian Ranjit S. Dye wrote that for 60 years after the book's publication, virtually nobody had such an interpretation until Henry Littlefield, a high school teacher, in his 1964 American Quarterly article, The Wizard of Oz, Parable on Populism. Littlefield posited that the book contained an allegory of the late 19th century bimetallism debate regarding monetary policy. Not only did Baum draw inspiration from the American land around him, but he also created Oz to display an American utopia where the issues of the day were solved. There is little distinction between utopia and fairy tale land. Baum believed that the imagination was the best tool for creating a striving society. In a later book in the Oz series, Baum writes, imaginations and dreams are likely to lead to the betterment of the world. The imaginative child will become the imaginative man or woman most apt to create. to invent and, therefore, to foster civilization. Quote, in this way, Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz as a modern fairy tale depicting Oz as an American utopia that displays numerous allusions and solutions to issues in the late 19th and early 20th century. The realm of Oz very closely resembles the United States. It contains 4 countries: the Land of the North, East, West, and South, and the national capital, the Emerald City. The U.S. and its inhabitants are often divided into similar categories such as Midwestern, Southern, etc. These locations are also separated by an American color scheme that was relevant to the U.S. during the 19th century. The color blue represents the industrial East, known for the blue-collar jobs. The South is red for the red earth it contains the redneck inhabitants. Yellow describes the West, denoting the California gold rush. Finally, the Emerald City is Washington, D.C., denoting greenbacks and the money of the country. The villains of the story are the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wicked Witch of the East. The witches use their power to control and enslave their subjects. There was an equal balance between good and evil, and until this balance was altered, there could be no change or development in Oz. This standoff can be seen as an illusion between the different political parties in the U.S. The Wicked Witch of the West represents the American West, including the wealthy railroad, oil barons, and nature. The American West's greatest weapon in the 19th century, though, was nature, most malignantly the drought. The effects lasted longer than any fire or twister, and a long enough drought could ruin a whole year's worth of crops. Thus, water as the weapon to kill the Witch of the West is quite poetic. The brown mass the witch's remains turn into resembles mud after a heavy storm. Dorothy even cleans the melted witch off the floor and her shoes as if she had walked through a rainy puddle. Baum's Wicked Witch of the East has been suggested to represent Eastern financial and industrial interests, such as Wall Street, which oppresses the agricultural citizens. The Witch of the East enslaved her subjects much as industrialism was thought to enslave the working class in 19th century Eastern America. Once Dorothy killed the Wicked Witch of the East, the balance of power could be shifted. Both these groups opposed populist efforts to move the U.S. to a bimetallic monetary standard, since this would have devalued the dollar and made investments less valuable. Workers and poor farmers supported the move away from the gold standard, as this would have lessened their crushing debt burdens. The Populist Party sought to build a coalition of Southern and Midwestern tenant farmers and Northern industrial workers. These groups are represented in the book by the Good Witches of the North and South. At the beginning of the novel, Dorothy is swept from her farm to Oz by a cyclone, which was frequently compared to the free silver movement in Baum's time. The yellow brick road represents the gold standard, and the silver shoes, which enable Dorothy to travel more comfortably, symbolizes the Populist Party's desire to construct a bimetallic standard of both gold and silver. In place of the gold standard, Oz is the abbreviated form of ounce, a standard measure of gold. When Dorothy and the Scarecrow walk through the forest, the road begins to be rough and patchy, causing the Scarecrow to trip and fall numerous times. The Scarecrow's falls on the yellow brick road resemble the damage farmers faced owing to deflation caused by the scarcity of gold. Dorothy, however, simply walks around the holes in the road, showing that the bimetallic standard works, even when gold was scarce. The other metal in the bimetal system would be relatively cheap. Therefore one bypasses deflation. Throughout the book, most of the characters do not know the magic behind the silver shoes. It is not until Dorothy meets Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, that she finds out that the Silver Shoes have had the power to transfer her back to Kansas all along. Baum is possibly alluding to the fact that the bimetallic standard has been a working solution to the economic crisis all along, though no one knows how to do it. Once Dorothy clicks her heels 3 times, she returns to Kansas, where she realizes that the Silver Shoes had fallen off in her flight through the air and were lost forever in the desert. The Silver Shoes were lost, much like the fight for the bimetallic standard, which began to fade away in 1900. The wizard is the national leader of Oz. Thus it is fitting for him to symbolize the President of the United States during the 19th century. Politicians have been known to have many faces. It is a must if they want to be able to be everything for everyone. The Great and Terrible Wizard of Oz agrees to meet with each traveler separately, allowing him to alter his appearance to best fit each character. When the gang returns having completed the wizard's task, they discover that the wizard is a fake and is actually just a common man who has made everyone believe he was powerful. The Scarecrow adds that he is a humbug, in which the wizard gladly says that he is exactly that. The wizard made promises he could not keep, as did many 19th century politicians. The wizard later states, "How can I help being a humbug, when all these people make me do things that everyone knows can't be done?" Showing that he was able to deceive others because others were willing to be deceived. While journeying to the Emerald City, Dorothy encounters a scarecrow, who represents a farmer. The Scarecrow believes he is a fool, since his head is full of straw and not brains. 4 years before the book's release, William Allen White published an article titled "What's the Matter with Kansas?" Quote, in the article, White questions why Kansas is unsatisfied and sarcastically answers saying America needs fewer white shirts and brains, implying Western farmers were ignorant, lazy and bad businessmen. The Scarecrow shares this opinion and doubts himself, believing he is inferior without a brain. In the same year White published his article, William Jennings Bryan delivered his famous Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention. Bryan fought for the farmers and argued against such accusations made by White, exclaiming, "The farmer who goes forth in the morning and toils all day, begins in the spring and toils all summer, and by the application of brain and muscle to the natural resources of this country creates wealth, is as much a businessman as the man who goes upon the board of trade and bets upon the price of grain." Baum shares Bryan's view on American farmers by showing that the Scarecrow is sharp and capable by his actions throughout the book. The book ends with farm interests achieving national importance, and farmers' true potential in politics being revealed once the illusion of ignorance has been removed. The next companion Dorothy meets on the yellow brick road is the Tin Woodman, who has been cursed by the now-deceased Wicked Witch of the East. He was once a hard worker yearning to earn money to start a family with a Munchkin girl. The witch enchanted his axe so that the woodman chopped off each of his limbs and eventually his body. Each time a tinner healed the woodman by replacing his body with tin. However, once the Tin Woodman's heart was removed, he could no longer love. The Tin Woodman symbolizes the Eastern and working man competing in an industrialized society. The 19th century man had to keep up with the machine in order to be useful and relevant. In this way, the Witch of the East's curse dehumanized a simple laborer so that the faster and better he worked, the more quickly he became a kind of machine. The Tin Woodman was caught in the rain and rusted in the same position for 1 year before Dorothy oils his joints to set him free. The Tin Woodman's year of waiting is parallel to the unemployment of Eastern workers during the severe depression of 1893 to 1897. His calls of help that were never heard relate to President Grover Cleveland's hard-hearted refusal to take action during this time to reinstate the economy. While the Tin Woodman stood still for a year, he finally slowed down enough to ponder life. During this time, he discovers that the greatest loss he had known was the loss of his heart, for without it he cannot love. Baum portrays the Tin Woodman as an Eastern worker who lost sight of family values for a moment. Part of the progressive movement in the 19th century was to re-establish the family as the center of American life. The Curse of the Tin Woodman by the Wicked Witch of the East is consistent with the depiction of the witch representing Wall Street and other Eastern big businesses during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The final addition to the traveling party is the Cowardly Lion. This character is hypothesized to be the famous populist politician William Jennings Bryan. The muscular, 6-foot-tall, 183 centimeters, political figure was known as a compassionate but powerful speaker, which could be compared to a lion's roar. Throughout the book, Baum is mostly sympathetic towards populist characters such as the Scarecrow. Thus, it seems odd that Baum would refer to the character portraying Bryan as cowardly. However, the late 19th century began an age of American expansionism in which the United States struggled to gain control of countries like Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from Spain. Bryan's non-violent and anti-imperialist stance on the popular Spanish-American War of 1898 was often referred to as unpatriotic and cowardly. Baum seems to take this criticism and turn it into a complaint towards Bryan, showing that although the lion is the king of the beasts, it shows more bravery to stand by than to run in towards unnecessary obstacles. No matter how popular, the Cowardly Lion's first encounter with the Tin Woodman shows support for both of their characters being based on Bryan and Eastern industrial workers, respectively. When they meet, the Cowardly Lion strikes the Tin Woodman with his sharp claws. But to his surprise, he could make no impression on the tin. Although the Woodman fell over in the road and lay still. Quote, this refers to Bryan's inability to get votes in the 1896 presidential election from Eastern workers owing to pressure from their employers to vote for McKinley. Bryan himself said, during the campaign I ran across various evidences of coercion, direct and indirect. Other historical sources share this opinion, noting, for some reason Labor remained singularly unimpressed. Thus, the Cowardly Lion's claws did not pierce the Tin Woodman body, just as Bryan's roar did not leave an impression with Eastern industrial workers. Baum's fairy tale contains many other allusions to American life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For instance, Dorothy's loyal companion, Toto, could be a play on teetotalers, which is a person who never drinks alcohol. The prohibitionists esteemed alcohol consumption should be unlawful, and they were longtime political allies of populists during the late 19th century. Toto trots soberly behind Dorothy on their adventure. The winged monkeys have been thought to resemble the Plains Indians, who were once free people, but were now enslaved by the Wicked Witch of the West. Their actions can be good or bad depending on how they are controlled. However, they belong to this country alone, and therefore cannot leave. As can be said for American Indians. The yellow Winkies that inhabit the land of the West could represent Asian workers in California. During the gold rush, the harsh work environment can be seen as enslavement. The lenses that the groups must wear before entering the city of Oz to dim the emerald shine turn out to be fake. Like the wizard, the Emerald City is not a city made of emeralds but a plain white city where the emerald color lenses cast a green hue on everything and everyone. This shows that anything can be made to look spectacular if you allow yourself to be tricked. Baum traveled all over the United States and would have been introduced to all these events in the 19th century, making it very likely that he drew inspiration from the land around him. Baum's modernized fairy tale, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, ends with both the Wicked Witch of the East and West defeated and Dorothy, Toto and the Wizard returning to the United States. The Scarecrow reigns over the Emerald City. Thus farmers achieve national importance. The Tin Woodman brings industrialization to the land of the West. The Cowardly Lion becomes the protector in the grander old forest, as Brian commanded a smaller number of politicians. Littlefield's thesis achieved some support, but has been strenuously attacked by others. Cultural impact. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz has become an established part of multiple cultures, spreading from its early young American readership to becoming known throughout the world. It has been translated or adapted into well over 50 languages, at times being modified in local variations. For instance, in some abridged Indian editions, the Tin Woodman was replaced with a horse. In Russia, a translation by Alexander Melentievich Volkov produced 6 books, The Wizard of the Emerald City series, which became progressively distanced from the Baum version, as Ellie and her dog Totoshka travel throughout the Magic Land. The 1939 film adaptation has become a classic of popular culture, shown annually on American television from 1959 to 1991 and then several times a year every year, beginning in 1999. More recently, the story has become an American stage production with an all-black cast, set in the context of modern African American culture. Critical response. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz received positive critical reviews upon release. In a September 1900 review, the New York Times praised the novel, writing that it would appeal to child readers and to younger children who could not read yet. The review also praised the illustrations for being a pleasant complement to the text. During the first 50 years after The Wonderful Wizard of Oz's publication in 1900, it received little critical analysis from scholars of children's literature. According to Ruth Berman of Science Fiction Studies, the lists of suggested reading published for juvenile readers never contained Baum's work. The lack of interest stemmed from the scholars' misgivings about fantasy, as well as to their belief that lengthy series had little literary merit. It has frequently come under fire over the years. In 1957, the director of Detroit's libraries banned The Wonderful Wizard of Oz for having no value for children of his day, for supporting negativism, and for bringing children's minds to a cowardly level. Professor Russell B. Nye of Michigan State University countered that, if the message of the Oz books, love, kindness, and unselfishness make the world a better place, seems of no value today, then maybe the time is ripe for reassessing a good many other things besides the Detroit Library's approved list of children's books. In 1986, 7 fundamentalist Christian families in Tennessee opposed the novel's inclusion in the public school syllabus and filed a lawsuit. They based their opposition to the novel on its depicting benevolent witches and promoting the belief that integral human attributes were individually developed rather than God-given. One parent said, "I do not want my children seduced into godless supernaturalism." Other reasons included the novel's teaching that females are equal to males and that animals are personified and can speak. The judge ruled that when the novel was being discussed in class, the parents were allowed to have their children leave the classroom. Leonard Everett Fisher of the Hornbook magazine wrote in 2000 that Oz has a timeless message from a less complex era, and it continues to resonate. The challenge of valuing oneself during impending adversity has not, Fisher noted, lessened during the prior 100 years. In a 2002 review, Bill Delaney of Salem Press praised Baum for giving children the opportunity to discover magic in the mundane things in their everyday lives. He further commended Baum for teaching millions of children to love reading during their crucial formative years. The Library of Congress has declared The Wonderful Wizard of Oz to be America's greatest and best-loved homegrown fairy tale, also naming it the first American fantasy for children and one of the most read children's books. Additions. After George M. Hill's bankruptcy in 1902, copyright in the book passed to the Bobbs Merrill Company. The editions they published lacked most of the in-text color and color plates of the original. It was not until the book entered the public domain in 1956 that new editions, either with the original color plates or new illustrations, proliferated. Notable among them are the 1986 Pennyroyal edition illustrated by Barry Moser, which was reprinted by the University of California Press, and the 2000 annotated Wizard of Oz edited by Michael Patrick Hearn, which was published by W. W. Norton and included all the original color illustrations, as well as supplemental artwork by Denslow. Other Centennial editions included University Press of Kansas's Kansas Centennial edition, illustrated by Michael McCurdy with black and white illustrations, and Robert Sabuda's pop-up book, Sequels. Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz without any thought of a sequel. After reading the novel, thousands of children wrote letters to him, requesting that he craft another story about Oz. In 1904, he wrote and published the first sequel, The Marvelous Land of Oz, explaining that he grudgingly wrote the sequel to address the popular demand. Baum also wrote sequels in 1907, 1908, and 1909. In his 1911 The Emerald City of Oz, he wrote that he could not continue writing sequels because Ozland had lost contact with the rest of the world. The children refused to accept this story. So Baum, in 1913 and every year thereafter until his death in May 1919, wrote an Oz book, ultimately writing 13 sequels. The Chicago Tribune's Russell McFall wrote that Baum explained the purpose of his novels in a note he penned to his sister, Mary Louise Brewster, in a copy of Mother Goose in Prose, 1897. His first book, he wrote, "To please a child is a sweet and a lovely thing that warms one's heart and brings its own reward." After Baum's death in 1919, Baum's publishers delegated the creation of more sequels to Ruth Plumly Thompson, who wrote 21. An original Oz book was published every Christmas between 1913 and 1942. By 1956, 5 million copies of the Oz books had been published in the English language, while hundreds of thousands had been published in 8 foreign languages. Adaptations. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz has been adapted to other media numerous times, most famously in The Wizard of Oz, the 1939 film starring Judy Garland, Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Burt Lahr. Until this version, the book had inspired a number of now less well-known stage and screen adaptations, including a profitable 1902 Broadway musical and 3 silent films. The 1939 film was considered innovative because of its songs, special effects, and revolutionary use of the new Technicolor. The story has been translated into other languages, at least once without permission, and adapted into comics several times. Following the lapse of the original copyright, the characters have been adapted and reused in spin-offs, unofficial sequels, and reinterpretations, some of which have been controversial in their treatment of Baum's characters. See also 1900 in literature. The International Wizard of Oz Club. The Baum Bugle. Zadoz. Notes and references. Notes. Footnotes. Bibliography. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz at Project Gutenberg. Down the Yellow Brick Road of Overinterpretation. By John J. Miller in the Wall Street Journal. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz public domain audiobook at LibriVox. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. 1900 illustrated copy. Publishers Green and Red illustrated cloth over boards. Illustrated end papers. Plate detached. Public domain. Charles E. Young Research Library. UCLA. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. An unabridged dramatic audio performance at Wired for Books. Online version of the 1900 first edition on the Library of Congress website. A Long and Dangerous Journey, A History of the Wizard of Oz on the Silver Screen, Scream It Loud. Com. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz at Internet Archive. Dorothy Gage, McLean County Museum of History.